While I was on an operating table fighting for my life, my mother-in-law packed 3 suitcases, called a moving company, and let herself into my house with the spare key she was never supposed to have. By the time I was discharged 6 days later, my photographs were gone from the walls, my home office had become her craft room, and she was already telling the neighbors that I probably wouldn't be myself again, and that she'd be taking over for the family's sake. She smiled at me when I walked through my own front door in a hospital wheelchair. That smile didn't last past midnight. Before the story begins, please let me know in the comments what state or country you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe so this channel can keep bringing you more. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 36 years old, and I own Bennett & Company Interiors, a design firm based in Boston that handles high-end residential and boutique commercial projects across New England. I built that company from a one-woman operation working out of a rented studio in Somerville into a firm with 11 employees and a wait list of clients willing to pay 6 figures for a full home renovation.
I'm not telling you this to brag.
I'm telling you because it matters for what comes later. Everything that happened in my house happened because of one document, and that document existed because of choices I made years before I ever met my husband. The house at the center of all of this is a 4-story brick townhouse on Mount Vernon Street in Beacon Hill. It belonged to my grandmother, Eleanor Bennett, a woman who raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 9. Eleanor was sharp, private, and unsentimental about money in exactly the way that saves a person's life later on. She bought that house in 1979 for what would sound like pocket change today, renovated it slowly over decades, and when she passed away 8 years ago, she left it to me outright, in my name only, through a trust that her own lawyer had drafted with surgical precision. The current appraised value is just over $4 million. I didn't earn that money. I inherited it. But everything I added to that house afterward, the kitchen renovation, the restored original moldings, the converted carriage house in the back that became my design studio, every dollar of that came from my business. I met Daniel Hayes about 6 years ago at a charity gala for a children's hospital. He was charming in an easy, low-effort way, the kind of charm that comes from a man who has never had to work very hard to be liked. He worked as a regional sales manager for a medical equipment company, made a comfortable but unremarkable salary, and lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Quincy that his mother had helped him decorate. We dated for about a year and a half before he proposed, and I said yes because, at the time, Daniel was kind, attentive, and seemed genuinely proud of what I'd built rather than threatened by it. What I didn't fully understand yet was that Daniel had spent his entire adult life being managed by his mother, Margaret Hayes, and that marrying him meant inheriting her opinions about everything from how I should fold towels to whether my work obsession was the reason we hadn't had children yet. Margaret is 64. She's been a widow for almost 15 years, ever since Daniel's father passed away from a heart attack, and in that time she has slowly turned her only son into something between a project and a possession. From the very beginning, Margaret made it clear, in the gentle, smiling, passive-aggressive way that some people have perfected into an art form, that she did not think I was right for Daniel. Not because of anything specific I'd done, but because I worked too much, traveled for client meetings, and, in her words during our engagement dinner, didn't seem like the kind of woman who'd want to slow down and make a real home. When Daniel and I got engaged, my attorney, a calm, methodical man named David Coleman who had handled my grandmother's estate and now handled mine, sat us both down and explained, very plainly, that the Mount Vernon Street house would remain my separate property under Massachusetts law because I had inherited it before the marriage, but that a prenuptial agreement would make that protection airtight and would also protect Daniel's modest retirement account and his car. Daniel signed it without complaint. He told me, and I believed him, that he didn't need to own anything of mine to feel like the house was his home too. What Daniel never told his mother, what he was, frankly, too embarrassed to tell his mother, was that he had signed away any claim to the house, in writing, with a notary present. Margaret spent the next 8 years of our marriage operating under the assumption that because her son lived there, the house was functionally the family house, which in her mind meant it was partially hers. She visited often. Too often, if I'm honest, though I tried not to keep score. She'd come for Sunday dinners and stay until Tuesday. She rearranged my kitchen cabinets for efficiency. She replaced the hand soap in my guest bathroom with a brand she preferred and left a small, pointed note about it. When I redid the front parlor in soft sage greens and warm brass fixtures, a project that was featured, incidentally, in a regional design magazine, Margaret walked through it once, sniffed, and said, "It's very you, dear. A little cold for a family home, but very you." I learned over the years to let most of it slide off me. I had a business to run. I didn't have the bandwidth to fight a war of attrition with my mother-in-law over throw pillows. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, my appendix was going to rupture while I was in the middle of a client walkthrough, and that the 6 days I'd spend recovering in Massachusetts General Hospital would be all the time Margaret Hayes needed to try to take my house out from under me. It started with a dull ache on my right side that I assumed, stupidly, was something I'd eaten. I pushed through a full day of client meetings, came home, and by 10 that night, I was doubled over on the kitchen floor with a fever of 102 and pain so sharp I couldn't stand up straight. Daniel drove me to the emergency room. By the time the surgeons got me into the operating room, my appendix had already ruptured, and what should have been a routine 40-minute laparoscopic procedure turned into an open surgery to clean out the infection that had started spreading through my abdomen. The surgeon told Daniel afterward that another few hours, and we'd have been dealing with full-blown sepsis. I woke up in a recovery room with a drainage tube, and 4-line running 3 different antibiotics, and a hospital social worker already gently explaining that I'd likely be admitted for 5 to 7 days. Daniel called his mother from the hospital waiting room sometime around 2 in the morning, while I was still in surgery. I wasn't there to hear that conversation, but I've since pieced together, mostly from Margaret's own words later and from my housekeeper, Rosa, what was said. Daniel, frightened and exhausted, told his mother that Claire was in surgery, that it was serious, and that he didn't know how he was going to manage work, the house, the dog, hospital visits, all at once. Margaret, by her own account, told him, "Don't worry about a thing, sweetheart. I'll come stay for a few days and take care of everything. You just focus on Claire." On paper, that sounds like exactly what a loving mother-in-law should say. In practice, it was the opening move of something else entirely. I spent my first full day in the hospital floating in and out of consciousness, dealing with pain management, nausea from the anesthesia, and a parade of nurses checking my vitals every 2 hours. Daniel sat with me for most of it, looking pale and useless in the particular way that men look when they're confronted with a hospital and have no job to do. Margaret arrived at the house that first evening with 2 suitcases. By the second evening, she had 3. I want to be honest with you. For the first 2 days, I genuinely didn't think about the house at all.
I was on a morphine drip.
I was focused on whether I could keep down a few sips of water without throwing up, on the burning ache around my incision every time I shifted in bed, on the 4 antibiotics that made my arm cold and heavy. Margaret texted me a few sugary, performative messages. "Resting up, sweetie. Don't worry about anything at home. It's all under control. Red heart," and I genuinely appreciated them because in that moment, under control sounded like a gift. It was Rosa who first made me uneasy. Rosa Delgado has worked for my family in some capacity since I was 19 years old. She started as my grandmother's housekeeper and stayed on with me after Eleanor passed, coming in 3 days a week to clean, manage the household calendar, water the plants in the conservatory, and generally keep the house running while I was buried in client work. Rosa is in her late 50s, fiercely loyal, and not the type to gossip or exaggerate. On the 3rd morning I was in the hospital, while Daniel had gone home to shower and change, Rosa texted me a single photo with no caption. It was a photograph of my home office, the converted front parlor on the 2nd floor where I keep my design archives, fabric samples, and the antique writing desk that had belonged to my grandmother. In the photo, my desk had been pushed against the wall, my filing cabinets were stacked with boxes on top of them, and in the center of the room sat a folding card table covered in scrapbooking supplies, ribbon spools, and a half-finished cross-stitch project. I stared at that photo for a long time before I texted back. "Rosa, what is this?" She called me less than a minute later. I could hear that she was trying to keep her voice low, the way you do when you don't want someone in the next room to hear you. "Miss Claire, I came in this morning to do my regular cleaning, and Mrs. Hayes told me I wasn't needed this week. She said she'd take care of the house herself while you recover, and that it was a good opportunity to declutter. She had already moved some of your things, Miss Claire. I only had a few minutes before she asked me to leave, but I wanted you to see this. I told Rosa it was fine, that Margaret was probably just trying to be helpful in her own way, and that I'd sort it out when I got home. I want to be clear with you. Even then, lying in a hospital bed with a drainage tube taped to my side, my first instinct was still to smooth things over. 8 years of marriage had trained that instinct into me pretty deeply. But something about that photo, my grandmother's desk, shoved against the wall like furniture in a storage unit, sat in my stomach like a stone for the rest of the day. On the 4th day, I had my first real conversation with Margaret in person. She came to visit, sat in the chair beside my bed, and patted my hand in a way that I think was meant to be comforting, but mostly felt like she was checking whether I was warm enough to still be useful. "You look better, dear," she said, in the tone people use for patients they've already mentally filed under fragile. "The doctors say you'll need a good long rest when you get home. No stress, no work, nothing taxing." I told Daniel, I said, maybe this is the universe's way of telling Claire to slow down. You can't run a business and run a household forever, can you? I smiled because I was tired and because I genuinely thought she was just being Margaret, a little tone-deaf, a little smug, but harmless. "I appreciate you helping out, Margaret. Really. I know it's a lot." "Oh, it's no trouble at all," she said, and there was something in the way she said it. Too quick, too pleased, that I filed away without quite knowing why. Honestly, it's been nice. The house feels different with someone really there, you know? Taking care of things properly.
I didn't think much of it at the time.
I was on painkillers, exhausted, and trying to keep down a cup of broth. It wasn't until later that night, after Margaret had left and Daniel had gone to get coffee, that something happened that finally cut through the fog. A nurse came in to change my 4-bag and, while she worked, casually asked if I needed help filling out some paperwork. Specifically, an Advanced Healthcare Directive and Durable Power of Attorney form that the hospital routinely offers to surgical patients. I told her I already had one on file from years ago, drawn up when my grandmother was sick, naming my attorney, David Coleman, as my agent. The nurse checked her computer and frowned slightly. "That's strange," she said. "There's a form here that was brought to the nurse's station yesterday afternoon. A family member dropped it off, said you'd asked her to bring it for you to sign. It's a healthcare proxy form, naming a different agent. It's not signed yet, it's just sitting in your file. Do you want me to pull it?" My stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with my incision. The form she handed me was a standard Massachusetts healthcare proxy. My name was already filled in at the top, in neat, careful handwriting that I recognized immediately as Margaret's. The line for agent, the person who would make medical decisions for me if I couldn't make them myself, had Margaret's own name written in. Underneath it, in the section for additional powers, someone had handwritten a note that had absolutely nothing to do with medical decisions. Asterisk, also acting as temporary household manager during recovery, authorized to manage residence, mail, and finances as needed for family's benefit. Asterisk, I read that sentence 3 times. Then I asked the nurse, as calmly as I could manage, to please not have anyone sign anything on my behalf, ever, under any circumstances, without my attorney present. She looked a little startled by my tone, but she nodded, made a note in my chart, and took the form away. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that because in a lot of stories like this is the part where the wronged woman breaks down. I didn't. What I felt instead was a kind of cold, clean clarity, the same feeling I get right before I tell a difficult client, very politely, that their renovation budget simply isn't going to cover the marble they want. Margaret hadn't just rearranged my home office. She had, while I was in surgery and unconscious, attempted to get a form into my hospital file that would have given her legal authority over my house, my mail, and my finances for the family's benefit. If I had signed that form in a groggy, post-anesthesia haze, which happens, by the way, more often than people realize because hospitals hand patients a lot of paperwork in those first foggy days, Margaret would have had, on paper, at least a colorable claim to be managing my affairs. I waited until Daniel came back with his coffee, and I asked him, very evenly, whether he knew anything about a healthcare proxy form his mother had brought to the hospital. He went very still. She mentioned something about wanting to help with paperwork while you were under. I didn't think it was a big deal. I figured it was just like insurance stuff. Daniel, I said, it names her as my medical decision maker, and it has a handwritten note giving her authority to manage the house and my finances. While I'm unconscious, without me knowing. He stared at me for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind his eyes. Not quite guilt, but the beginning of an understanding that something he'd brushed off as mom being mom might actually be a problem. Claire, I'm sure she didn't mean it like that. She probably just thought, since I'm at work so much, someone needed to. I need you to call your mother, I said, and tell her that no one signs anything on my behalf. Ever. And I need you to ask her to leave my office the way she found it. He said he would. I believed at the time that he meant it. What I didn't yet know was that Margaret had no intention of stopping, and that Daniel, even when confronted directly, was constitutionally incapable of actually following through. That night, after Daniel left, I lay awake for a long time, staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles of my hospital room, and I did something I'm not particularly proud of, but which I also don't regret. I opened the security app on my phone. A few years ago, after a string of break-ins in our neighborhood, I'd had a small home security system installed. Nothing elaborate, just 3 discrete cameras covering the front entry, the kitchen, and the second-floor hallway outside my office, all feeding into an app on my phone that I almost never checked. Daniel knew the cameras existed, but I doubt he ever thought about them, and I'm fairly confident Margaret had no idea. I'd genuinely forgotten about them myself until that moment, lying in a hospital bed at 11 at night, suddenly very motivated to know what was happening inside my own house. I opened the app. The kitchen camera was live. And there, in my kitchen, at 11 o'clock at night, was Margaret Hayes on the phone, sitting at my kitchen island with a glass of my wine, talking to someone in a voice that, even silently, even just from her body language and the way she was gesturing with the wine glass, looked nothing like the soft, fluttery woman who patted my hand in the hospital that afternoon. I turned the volume up. "No, I'm telling you, it's perfect timing," she was saying, laughing in a way I genuinely never heard from her before, sharp, satisfied, almost girlish. "She's going to be laid up for weeks, Carol, weeks. And Daniel is useless without someone managing things. You know how he is." I told him I'd help out. She did air quotes with her free hand, and even through a grainy security camera, I could see the smugness on her face. And honestly, once I'm in here, why would I leave? This house is far too big for the two of them anyway, and frankly it should have been in both their names from the start, don't you think? 8 years married, and that woman still treats it like it's hers and Daniel's just visiting.
Well,
We'll see about that. I sat up so fast that my incision screamed at me, and I had to grab the side rail of the hospital bed and breathe through a wave of pain that had nothing to do with appendicitis. The call went on. I listened to almost 20 minutes of it, propped up against my pillows with my 4-line taped awkwardly to keep it from pulling, my heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with my fever. Margaret told her friend, someone named Carol, apparently from her book club, that she'd already called a moving company to bring a few essentials from her condo in Worcester the next day. That she'd been quietly going through my office and had found some very interesting paperwork she intended to look into. That she thought, realistically, Daniel and I should consider downsizing once I was back on my feet for Claire's health, and that the Mount Vernon Street house, with its in-law suite potential on the lower level, really would make so much more sense as Daniel's and my place going forward, closer to my doctor's, more manageable for him, and frankly, dear, that woman has never once in 8 years asked me how I'm doing in that house, so I don't see why I should feel guilty about finally getting some use out of it. She said, and this is the line that I have never forgotten, word for word, once she sees how much smoother everything runs with someone competent in charge, she might not even fight it. And if she does fight it, well, Daniel's name is on that mortgage statement just as much as hers, isn't it? I've seen the mail. We'll see what a judge thinks about a wife trying to push her husband's own mother out onto the street after everything I've done for this family. I want to pause here and tell you something important, because it's the entire hinge of this story. Daniel's name was never on a mortgage statement for that house, because there has never been a mortgage on that house. My grandmother paid it off in cash decades before she died. The mail Margaret had seen, rifling through my office while I was unconscious in an operating room, was almost certainly my property tax bill or a homeowner's insurance renewal, documents that, in Massachusetts, list the owner of record, which is, and has only ever been me. Margaret Hayes had built an entire fantasy of joint ownership, financial leverage, and legal standing on top of a piece of mail she had not actually understood. I closed the app. I set my phone face down on the hospital tray table. And then I did the only thing that made sense to me in that moment. I called my lawyer. It was almost midnight, but David Coleman has been my family's attorney for over 20 years, and he answered on the second ring, the way people do when a client calling at midnight from a hospital bed is something they've learned to take seriously rather than be annoyed by.
Claire.
Are you all right? Daniel called my office earlier today to ask about something. A form, I think. My paralegal flagged it for me, but I hadn't called back yet. I'm fine, I said, which wasn't entirely true, but it was true enough for the purposes of this conversation. David, I need you to listen to something. I played him the recording from the security camera, 20 minutes of Margaret Hayes in my kitchen, drinking my wine, laying out a plan to take over my house while I recovered from emergency surgery. There was a long silence on the line when it finished. Then David said, in the careful, unhurried tone he uses when he's actually furious, but has trained himself not to show it, Claire, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Do not engage with Margaret on this. Do not confront her from the hospital. Do not let Daniel try to handle it on his own. I'm going to need a few things from you, and then I want you to focus on getting better because the recovery is going to matter more than anything else over the next few days. Can you do that for me? What do you need? First, the recording. Forward it to me with a timestamp from the app, exactly as it is. Don't edit it, don't clip it, send me the whole file. Second, I want to pull the deed and the trust documents tomorrow morning, just to refresh everything and confirm there's been zero change in title, which I'm certain there hasn't been, but I want it in hand. Third, and this is the important one, Claire, I want you to think very carefully about whether you want to handle this quietly, as a family matter, or whether you want this documented formally, because attempting to obtain power of attorney over an incapacitated person through deception and entering and taking control of someone's residence without their consent while they're hospitalized are not small things. Those are things a court would care about. I'm not telling you to go that route. I'm telling you that you have that route if you want it. I thought about my grandmother's desk, pushed against the wall like garbage. I thought about Margaret's voice on that recording. We'll see what a judge thinks about a wife trying to push her husband's own mother out onto the street. I thought about 8 years of small comments, 8 years of very you dear, but a little cold for a family home, 8 years of being managed, gently and relentlessly, by a woman who had apparently been waiting the entire time for an opening like this. David, I said, I want it documented. Quietly for now. But I want everything ready. And I want the deed in hand, the actual physical copy, with the trust transfer attached, by the time I'm discharged. I think I'm going to need to show it to someone. Consider it done, he said. Now get some sleep, Claire. You've got 2 more days in there, minimum, and you're going to need every bit of strength you've got. He was right about the 2 more days. What he didn't know, what none of us knew yet, was just how much Margaret was going to accomplish in that time. Over the next 48 hours, I checked the security app obsessively, the way you check a wound you've been told not to touch. I watched, in grainy, time-stamped fragments, as my house was slowly and methodically remade into Margaret Hayes' house. A moving truck arrived on the 5th day, a small one, the kind you rent for a studio apartment move, but it was enough. I watched 2 men carry in a recliner, several boxes, a floor lamp I recognized from Margaret's condo, and this is the detail that finally made something in me go very quiet and very still, a framed photograph, roughly 2 feet by 3 feet, of Margaret and her late husband on their wedding day, which I watched her hang, with her own hands, in the spot in our front hallway where Daniel's and my wedding portrait had hung for 8 years. Our portrait wasn't in the frame anymore. I never found out, until much later, where it ended up. I watched Margaret give Rosa's number to a different cleaning service, a service she'd apparently used at her own condo for years, and dismiss Rosa entirely, telling her over the phone, which the kitchen camera happened to catch, "We won't be needing you this week, dear, but thank you so much. I'll let Claire know when she's back to normal, and we can discuss whether we'll continue with your services going forward." We'll discuss whether we'll continue with your services. Rosa, who had worked for my family for 17 years. I watched Margaret on a video call with a woman in a blazer holding a tablet, a real estate agent I'd learn later, a woman named Patricia Coyle from a firm in Cambridge, walking her room by room through my house on her phone's camera, saying things like, "And obviously this would need some work to make it feel less cluttered, but the bones are wonderful, and the location, well, you know Beacon Hill, and no, nothing's official yet. I just wanted you to get a sense of it because once my son and daughter-in-law are settled somewhere more appropriate for them, I think this could really be the place for me, and frankly, I'd love your read on what it might be worth, just so I have a sense of things." A sense of things. My grandmother's house. My house. Appraised on a video call by a real estate agent while I lay in a hospital bed with a drainage tube in my side because Margaret wanted a sense of things. And I watched. This is the last clip I'll describe because it's the one that finally moved me from cold anger to something more deliberate. Margaret sitting in my living room with a cardboard box on her lap, going through a stack of my framed photographs. Photos of my grandmother. Photos of me as a child. In that house, on that staircase. Photos from my wedding to Daniel. She wasn't destroying them. That would almost have been easier to be angry about in a clean way. She was sorting them, putting some in the box, presumably for storage, and replacing the empty frames, one by one, with photos of her own family. Margaret and Daniel as a child. Margaret and her late husband. Margaret at what looked like a 50th birthday party. By the time she was done, the gallery wall in my front hallway, 8 years of my life, my grandmother's life, our wedding, had become a shrine to the Hayes family, curated by a woman who had let herself into my house with a key she should never have had, while I was unconscious on an operating table 40 minutes away. I forwarded every clip to David Coleman. I didn't say much in the message. I didn't need to. The morning I was discharged, a hospitalist came by to do my final checks, sign off on my pain management plan, and go over discharge instructions. No heavy lifting, no driving for 2 weeks. Watch the incision site for signs of infection. Follow up with the surgeon in 10 days. Daniel was there to drive me home. He looked nervous in a way I hadn't seen from him before, fidgeting with his car keys, and I realized, with a strange detached clarity, that he knew. Not everything. I don't think Daniel ever fully grasped the scope of what his mother had done until much later, but he knew enough. He knew his mother had moved things. He knew the photo wall had changed, because he'd been sleeping in the house in a guest room, because, as Margaret had informed him, with the breezy confidence of someone who had simply decided this was how things were now, the master bedroom needs to stay set up for when Claire's home and needs quiet, dear, and besides, I've put my things in there for now since I'm the one up at night managing things. Margaret had taken our bedroom. Daniel had been sleeping in the guest room of his own house for 5 days, and either hadn't thought to question it or hadn't had the spine to. I called David Coleman from the hospital parking garage, while Daniel loaded my small bag into the trunk. "I'm being discharged now," I told him. "We're heading home." "I have the deed," he said. "I have the trust transfer documents, the property tax statement showing sole ownership, and a letter, very calm, very factual, nothing dramatic, laying out, in plain terms, the legal status of the property and the consequences of unauthorized access to and control over a residence belonging solely to another person, including the attempted use of a healthcare proxy form to extend that control to finances. I can have a courier bring the folder to your house within the hour, or I can come myself. Given everything, Claire, I think I should come myself."
"Come," I said.
"Give us about 40 minutes to get home first. The drive from Mass General to Beacon Hill takes about 10 minutes on a good day." It felt much longer. I sat in the passenger seat, still moving carefully because every bump in the road sent a small jolt of pain through my abdomen, and I watched the familiar brownstones of Beacon Hill slide past the window, the wrought iron, the gas lamps, the brick sidewalks. And I thought about how strange it was that the outside of my world looked exactly the same, while the inside of it had been quietly rearranged by someone who had been waiting 8 years for the chance. Daniel parked in front of the house. He came around to help me out of the car, and I let him because my body genuinely needed the support even if the rest of me didn't want to lean on him for anything just then. We went up the front steps together. He unlocked the door. And there was Margaret, standing in the front hallway, beneath her wedding portrait, beneath a gallery wall that was no longer mine, smiling the same warm smile she'd given me in the hospital, already moving toward us with her arms half open, as if she were about to embrace me. Claire. Oh, look at you, you poor thing. You look exhausted. Come in, sit down. I've made up the daybed in the den so you don't have to manage the stairs. Daniel, help her, don't just stand there. And I made a chicken soup, nothing fancy, but it's good for healing, my mother always said. Margaret, I said. I want to tell you that I said it loudly or sharply or with some kind of dramatic flourish. I didn't. I said it quietly, the way I might say someone's name to get their attention in a meeting, and something about the tone, flat, even completely without the apologetic warmth she was used to from me, made her stop talking mid-sentence. I'd like everyone to sit down in the living room for a few minutes, I said. I have something I need to go over with you both before I rest. It won't take long. Claire, honestly, you should be resting. You just got out of living room, please, I said, and walked there myself, slowly, one careful step at a time, past the photo wall that no longer had a single picture of me on it, into the living room where Margaret's recliner now sat where my grandmother's wingback chair used to be, and I sat down on the edge of the sofa and I waited. Daniel sat beside me. Margaret, after a beat, sat in the recliner, her recliner, in my living room, looking between us with an expression that was starting, very slightly, to lose its warmth around the edges. While I was in surgery, I said, and for the 5 days after, while I was recovering in a hospital bed, you moved into this house, Margaret. You moved your furniture in. You took down photographs of my family and replaced them with photographs of yours. You dismissed Rosa, who has worked for this household for 17 years, without asking me. You took my office, my grandmother's writing desk, and turned it into storage. You took my bedroom, and you had a real estate agent walk through my house on a video call to give you a sense of things, because, and I'm quoting you here, you thought that once Daniel and I were settled somewhere more appropriate, this house could really be the place for you. The color drained out of Margaret's face by degrees, the way it does when someone is trying very hard to figure out how much you actually know before they decide how to respond. Claire, I don't know where you're getting. You also brought a healthcare proxy form to the hospital. I continued, in the same even tone, with a handwritten addition giving you authority to manage this house, my mail, and my finances for the family's benefit, while I was unconscious from anesthesia. A nurse caught it before anyone could put it in front of me to sign. I want to be very clear. If that form had been signed, even by accident, even by me in a confused state right after surgery, it would have given you legal authority over things that have nothing to do with my health. That's not helping out, Margaret. I think you know that. Daniel, Margaret said, turning to him, and her voice had shifted now, gone thin and wounded. Daniel, are you going to let her speak to me like this? After everything I've done, I dropped everything. I came here, I took care of this house while your wife was in the hospital, and this is the thanks I get? She's accusing me of what, exactly, Claire? Of caring about this family? I think, Daniel said, and his voice came out smaller than I'd ever heard it. I think you need to hear what Claire has to say, Mom. I reached into the folder David Coleman had dropped off 20 minutes earlier. He was sitting at that moment in his car down the block, having offered, very kindly, to be nearby in case I needed him, but to let me handle the conversation myself first, and I took out a single document. The deed. I didn't slam it down. I didn't wave it around. I set it gently on the coffee table between us, open to the page that mattered, and I turned it slightly so Margaret could read it without having to lean forward. This is the deed to this house, I said. It's a trust transfer, executed when my grandmother passed away 8 years ago. The owner of record is Claire Eleanor Bennett. Just me. There is no mortgage on this property, Margaret, which means there's never been a mortgage statement with Daniel's name on it. I think whatever you saw in my office was probably a property tax bill or an insurance renewal, both of which also list me, and only me, as the owner. There's also a prenuptial agreement, signed by both Daniel and me before our wedding, which Daniel's own attorney reviewed at the time, confirming that this house is and will remain my separate property, regardless of the length of our marriage. I let that sit for a moment. Margaret was staring at the document, not picking it up, just staring, and I watched her read the words sole owner and Claire Eleanor Bennett, trustee over and over, as if rereading them might change what they said. This is, she started and stopped. Started again. This is impossible. Daniel, you told me, you said years ago when we talked about it, you said the house was yours too. You said, I never said that, Mom. Daniel said quietly. I think you might have just always assumed that, and I never corrected you because it never seemed to matter. It matters now, doesn't it? Margaret snapped, and for the first time, the warm, fluttery performance was completely gone, and what was left underneath was something much harder and much angrier. 8 years, Daniel. 8 years you've lived here. 8 years I've watched you live in someone else's house like a guest, and you never thought that mattered. It's not someone else's house, Daniel said. It's Claire's house. It's always been Claire's house. Mom, I think I let you believe something else because it was easier than having this conversation, and that's on me. But it doesn't change what's true. I want to pause here and acknowledge something, because it's important. This was the moment Daniel finally, for the first time in 8 years, said something true and difficult to his mother's face instead of letting the moment pass. It didn't undo 5 days of damage. It didn't undo 8 years of small comments and quiet undermining. But it was something, and I noticed it, and though I didn't say so out loud in that moment, it mattered to me. I'm not asking you to leave because I'm angry, Margaret. I said, and this part was true. By then, the cold fury I'd felt in the hospital had settled into something calmer, something closer to simple, final clarity. I'm asking you to leave because what happened this week, moving in without asking, dismissing my staff, attempting to obtain authority over my finances through a hospital paperwork form, having my house appraised behind my back. Those aren't things you do in someone else's home if you respect that it's their home. And I think, somewhere underneath all of this, you've never really believed it was my home at all. I think you've been waiting 8 years for an opportunity like this one. And I think, now that you know the truth about whose name is actually on this deed, you understand that the plan you laid out to your friend Carol 2 nights ago, the one about Daniel's name being on the mortgage and what a judge might think, that plan was never going to work. Because there is no mortgage, Margaret. There never was. There's just my grandmother's house with my name on it, and a guest who let herself stay much longer than she was invited. Margaret's face when I mentioned Carol's name, when she realized I knew about the phone call, the whine, the laughter, the we'll see about that, went through something I can only describe as a structural collapse. The performance didn't just slip. It fell apart entirely, all at once, the way a building implodes when the supports are pulled from underneath it at exactly the right points. You had me recorded, she said, her voice rising for the first time. In this, you had cameras spying on me? They're security cameras, I said. They've been there for years.
Daniel knows about them.
They're for protecting the house from burglars, Margaret, not for spying on family, which, I'll point out, is exactly the kind of thing you wouldn't need to worry about if you hadn't spent 5 days doing things in this house that you knew, on some level, you had no right to do. She stood up. Her recliner, rocked slightly behind her. I am not going to sit here and be lectured by a woman who married my son for convenience, who's never once, not once, in 8 years, treated this family like it mattered as much as her precious business. Mom, Daniel said, standing up too, and his voice had something in it now that I genuinely hadn't heard from him before. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of exhausted firmness. Stop. Please. Just stop. Claire almost died this week. You know that, right? The surgeon told us, if we'd waited a few more hours, it could have been sepsis. And while she was in surgery, you were planning how to take her house. I need you to actually hear that. I need me to actually hear that because I think I've been letting things slide for a really long time, and I think this is the first time it's ever actually cost something. The room was very quiet for a moment. Outside, I could hear the faint sound of a car idling. David Coleman, I assumed, still waiting down the block, giving us the space he'd promised. I I said, into that quiet. It would be best if you went back to your condo tonight, Margaret. I'll have the moving company that brought your things here today come back tomorrow morning to take them back. I'll cover the cost since it was my plan, not yours. That's changing. Your photographs, your recliner, all of it. I'd ask that you return the items you took from my office and my walls before you go, if you can manage that tonight. And the photographs of my family, my grandmother, my wedding, those need to go back up exactly where they were. You're throwing me out, Margaret said, and there was real shock in her voice now. The shock of someone who has never, not once in her life, been on the receiving end of a consequence she didn't see coming. After everything, Daniel, are you really going to let her throw your own mother out into the night? It's 9:30 in the morning, Mom, Daniel said, and I could hear, underneath the exhaustion, something that might have almost been the beginning of a wry humor, the kind that surfaces sometimes in families right at the edge of a crisis. It's not exactly into the night.
And yeah,
I think you should go home. I think you and I need to have a longer conversation separately about a lot of things. But not today. Today, Claire needs to rest in her own bedroom, in her own house. And I'd like to help her get there. I will give Margaret this much credit. She did not scream or throw anything or stage one final dramatic scene on her way out the door, though I half expected her to. What she did instead was worse, in its own way. She went very stiff, very formal, and said, in a voice that had gone cold and clipped, I see.
Well,
I suppose I know where I stand. Then, in this family. She gathered her purse and her coat from the front closet, my front closet, with quick, jerky movements, and at the door, she turned back, and for just a moment, the mask slipped one more time, and what was underneath it wasn't anger. It was something closer to humiliation, raw and unguarded, the look of a woman who had genuinely believed, for 5 days, that she had finally gotten the thing she'd wanted for years, only to discover that the thing had never been hers to take in the first place. I hope you're happy, Claire, she said. I hope this house is everything you want it to be.
It already was, I said.
That's sort of the point. She left. I heard the front door close, heard her heels on the brick steps outside, heard a cab. She must have called one while gathering her things, pull up a few minutes later. By the time I'd made my way, slowly, to the den, where the daybed she'd set up for me was at least a kind thought even if everything around it wasn't, I heard the cab pull away. David Coleman came by that evening, briefly, to drop off a copy of the letter he'd drafted, calm, factual, no threats, just a clear written record of the legal status of the property and a polite but firm note that any future access to the residence or its records would require Claire Bennett's express written consent. He didn't think it would ever need to be sent. He was right. It never did. But having it in a folder in my office, which Rosa, bless her, came back the very next day to help me put back together, desk and all, mattered to me in a way I can't fully explain except to say that some peace of mind is worth having on paper, even if you never need to use it. The moving company came back the next morning, as promised, and took Margaret's recliner, her boxes, her wedding portrait, and her floor lamp back to Worcester. I paid for it because I'd said I would, and because, petty as this might sound, I wanted very specifically for it to be my money that undid what she'd started, the same way it had always been my money, quietly, that had made the house what it was in the first place. The photographs took longer to sort out. Some of them, the ones Margaret had boxed up for storage, Rosa found in the basement, stacked neatly, almost carefully, in a way that suggested Margaret hadn't actually intended to throw them away, just to remove them. Daniel and I spent an evening about a week after I came home, going through that box together and rehanging the gallery wall. My grandmother, my parents from photos taken before the accident, when I was a baby, our wedding portrait, which we found, eventually, in the back of a closet in the guest room, the room Margaret had assigned Daniel to sleep in, ironically, wrapped in a towel, as if even Margaret hadn't quite been able to throw it away, only hide it. Daniel and I had a longer conversation, the kind we should probably have had years earlier, about his mother, about the prenup he'd never told her about the small comments he'd let slide for 8 years because confronting his mother had always felt harder than absorbing whatever she said, about the fact that, somewhere along the way, he'd let keeping the peace become a synonym for letting Claire deal with it. I won't pretend that conversation fixed everything overnight. It didn't. But it was real, and it was the first time in our marriage that Daniel actually said out loud, "I think I've made you the buffer between me and my mother for 8 years, and that's not fair, and I want to do better." Whether he actually did better, that's a longer story and mostly a good one, but it's not the story I'm telling you today. As for Margaret, she called Daniel about 2 weeks later, not to apologize, exactly, but to smooth things over, in her words, suggesting that perhaps everyone had been under a lot of stress, and that it would be best if we all moved past this little misunderstanding. Daniel told her, gently but clearly, that he loved her, that he hoped they could have a relationship going forward, but that any future visits to our house would need to be discussed and agreed to in advance by both of us, and that the days of her having a key or assuming open access were over. She didn't take that well at first. There was a stretch of a few months where she barely called at all, and when she did, the conversations were stiff and short. But over time, and I think, honestly, this had less to do with anything Daniel or I did and more to do with Margaret slowly running out of people willing to hear the story the way she wanted it told, things settled into something quieter. She comes for dinner, occasionally, now, by invitation, and she's never once, in the time since, tried to rearrange so much as a coaster. I went back to work about 3 weeks after my surgery, slower than I wanted to because my body still needed time even after my mind was ready. Bennett and company had 3 projects in progress while I was out, and my team, 11 people who, it turns out, are very good at their jobs even when I'm not hovering, handled all of them beautifully. One of those projects, as it happens, was a full renovation of a Back Bay brownstone for a young couple who just inherited it from the wife's grandmother. I thought about that a lot during my recovery, about how often the things that matter most in a house aren't the things you can see. The moldings, the marble, the brass fixtures, those are beautiful, and I love them, and they're my whole career. But the thing that actually mattered in the end, the thing that decided everything that happened in my house during those 6 days, was a piece of paper in a filing cabinet with my name on it that had been sitting there quietly for 8 years, waiting for the one moment it would actually need to matter. It's been almost a year now since that week. The gallery wall in my front hallway looks exactly the way it used to. My grandmother, my parents, our wedding portrait, all back in their places. Rosa still comes 3 days a week, and I gave her a raise, partly as an apology for the week she wasn't needed and partly because, frankly, she'd earned it years ago, and I'd been slow to notice. My home office is back to being my home office, my grandmother's desk back in its spot by the window, the light hitting it the same way it has for 45 years. And the deed, the actual physical document, the one I set down so quietly on my coffee table that morning, is back in the fireproof box in my office where it's lived for 8 years, doing exactly what it was always meant to do, sitting there, quietly being true, whether or not anyone ever needed to look at it. Most of the time, nobody does. But for 6 days last spring, it was the only thing in that entire house that didn't move, didn't get boxed up, didn't get replaced, and in the end, it was the only thing that mattered. If you've made it this far, thank you for reading. If you've ever had a family member, in-law or otherwise, try to take over your space, your life, or your peace while you were down, I hope this story gave you a little bit of the satisfaction I felt sitting on that sofa, sliding one quiet piece of paper across the coffee table. Sometimes the loudest victories are the ones that don't need to be loud at all. Let me know in the comments if you've ever dealt with something like this, and if you want more stories like this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from.